She told people I was ungrateful. Said I'd gone off the rails. Said I needed time to find myself. What she didn't say was that I stopped showing up because I got tired of being auctioned off at every brunch, every gala, every garden party where I was the polished daughter she dangled like proof she'd made it. What she didn't say was that I built something with my hands, something real, and when it started getting attention, she tried to turn it into her comeback. This story isn't about revenge. It's about what happens when you stop performing for the person who made you feel performable. I used to believe my mother loved me the way most mothers love their daughters, softly, protectively, without condition. But in our house, love always came with a purpose, a performance, a trade, like everything else she valued. Her name is Lillian Monroe, though she prefers Mrs. Monroe when people might be listening. She came from a town so small it didn't have a stoplight, then married my father, who had money, then decided she'd never go back. I was her first and only child, her mirror polished to show the world how far she'd climbed, her proof that she belonged. Every morning began the same way, her voice slicing through the quiet, reminding me what was expected. Hair brushed, posture up, smile without showing too many teeth. It wasn't instruction, it was survival. We weren't rich enough to be secure, only rich enough to be watched. At parties, she'd grip my wrist just tight enough to leave a mark, whispering, "Remember who's watching," before we walked through those marble doors. I thought she meant strangers, but later, I realized she meant everyone, especially herself. By 8, I knew how to shake hands, laugh politely, answer questions about school without mentioning scholarships, and never, ever mention the parts of our life that didn't shine. When my father traveled, I'd sleep in her bed, not because she was lonely, but because she needed me close, like a prized object she couldn't risk losing. Her affection was measured in outcomes, grades, compliments, appearances. When I brought home a trophy, she kissed my hair. When I cried, she sighed like I'd broken something expensive. She loved presenting me. That's what it was, presentation, like a debutante showing her gown. At galas, she'd introduce me with a tone so bright it almost sounded proud. "This is my daughter, Mira. She's at Hawthorne Academy," and people would smile and say, "She's beautiful," and she'd say, "She gets that from her father, never from her." That was her brand of humility, owning me publicly while erasing herself selectively, using my existence like a currency she could cash whenever she needed social approval. At home, the air was quieter but heavier, filled with the hum of expectations. She'd watch me from across the kitchen island, her eyes scanning for mistakes the way some people check for dust. "Do you want to make people uncomfortable?" She'd ask if I wore jeans instead of a dress, as if comfort was a flaw. My childhood felt staged, rehearsed, precise, like she was directing a play I hadn't agreed to perform in. I learned early that peace meant performance, and performance meant love. On weekends, we visited families she wanted to impress. The wives drank wine and complimented each other's dining rooms while the husbands talked stocks and golf. I'd sit still, quiet, smiling when prompted, pretending I understood what legacy meant. My mother would touch my shoulder gently whenever I spoke, guiding my sentences like a teleprompter in human form. Later, in the car, she'd critique my phrasing, my tone, even my laughter. "It's important to sound effortless," she'd say. "People respect ease." I learned to fake ease until it felt like breathing. By high school, I stopped bringing friends home. The walls echoed with too much silence, and the smell of lavender polish lingered like warning. My mother had a way of turning every visit into an audition. She'd charm my friends, then dissect them once they left. "That girl's mother works at the club, not a member," she'd remark, like it was a flaw. I started lying about where I spent weekends, said I had projects, said I needed quiet, but really I needed air, space where I wasn't being curated. Looking back, I think she loved me the way people love rare china, carefully, conditionally, proud to own but terrified to see crack. She mistook control for care, fear for ambition, and thought she was building me into someone unbreakable, but what she built was an echo, a version of herself too afraid to disappoint. And still, Even knowing that, I kept trying to please her because when your mother's love feels like a privilege you have to earn, losing it feels like dying. I was 22 when I first realized my mother didn't see me as a person, but as a piece of her strategy, an asset, a tool she polished to reflect well on her, and when I moved into my first apartment downtown, she brought over crystal coasters, monogrammed towels, and a guest list. Just for hosting, she said, setting them down like breadcrumbs. She didn't ask what I wanted, or who I wanted to be, just reminded me that I was being watched, always, even when no one was looking, especially then. She started inviting me to more functions after that, charity luncheons, silent auctions, alumni teas filled with women who wore soft pastels and hard smiles, and each time, she introduced me like I was a polished resume. Myra's teaching at Hawthorne, the private school, you know the one, and they'd nod with approval like I was a handbag they recognized. She didn't ask how I liked the job, or if I felt alone in that building full of stone hallways and whispered judgment. She just liked that I sounded successful. The more I pulled away, the more she pushed forward, like she couldn't separate my presence from her own social relevance. When I started dating someone she didn't approve of, a man named Jordan, who played piano in hotel lounges and called me by my full name with softness, she invited him over for dinner, then spent the evening correcting him. Actually, it's Pinot Grigio, not Gris. And when he left early, she said, "You could do better, Mira." Someone with presence, like love was a strategy, like affection was a transaction. Jordan was kind, quieter than she expected, but he saw her clearly. She doesn't want a daughter, he told me once, lying on the floor of my apartment while vinyl played in the background. She wants a performance partner, and I laughed, because it hurt too much to say he was right. I started skipping things, excuses piling up, grading papers, traffic, migraines, and she started sending guilt by text. They asked about you. I told them you were busy, but they were disappointed, like my absence was a breach of contract. The turning point came the week of the Langford Garden Party, the one event she treated like Easter and Christmas combined, and I said I wouldn't go. I had a pop-up event with local artists, a ceramic series I'd been working on for months, something I was proud of, something mine, and when I told her, she stared at me like I'd spoken a different language. "You'd rather sell bowls than show your face?" she said, and I said, yes, and her expression didn't change, it just hardened, like something had frozen between us. That weekend, she went without me, wore a buttercream dress with pearls, stood beside other women whose daughters smiled beside them in matching tones, and I imagined she told them I had the flu, or a work conflict, or a sudden obligation to my school. She never called afterward, didn't send photos like she usually did, just silence, like my absence had created a bruise she didn't want to touch. I should have felt guilty, but instead, I felt something else, stillness, like stepping out of a costume that had always been 2 sizes too small. Later that week, my cousin sent me a photo from the party, my mother standing alone by the fountain, hands clasped, smile tight, and the caption read, "Aunt Lillian looked a little lost this year," and I stared at that photo for a long time, wondering if she even noticed, if it registered, that I hadn't just skipped a party, I'd stepped off the stage entirely. And once you leave a stage, it's hard to pretend the lights don't blind you, the script doesn't itch, the applause doesn't feel earned. She started saying strange things after that, subtle digs disguised as observations. "Your clothes look more relaxed, you've gained confidence, it shows, people still ask about you." Like, every sentence was a reminder of the space I was supposed to occupy. I started to realize she wasn't angry because I'd changed. She was angry because she couldn't control the change, couldn't package it, couldn't present it. She thought I was a brand extension, and when I refused to cooperate, she treated it like a betrayal, not a boundary. Clay has this way of humbling you. It doesn't care who you think you are or what you're trying to prove. It demands presence, patience, a kind of surrender I wasn't raised to understand, and yet the first time I pressed my palms into a slab of wet stoneware, something inside me quieted, not in a sad way, but in the way that silence sometimes feels like truth. I'd started small, weekend classes in a community studio, paying in cash so my mother wouldn't see the charge, wouldn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. I told her I was picking up meditation, which wasn't a lie, just a softened version of the truth, because shaping clay did something meditation never could. It gave form to the parts of myself I couldn't say out loud. At school, I was still teaching literature, still wearing cardigans and grading papers in red ink, but after hours, I was barefoot in a room that smelled like earth and dust, shaping pieces that felt like memory. The first bowl I made was uneven, but it held water, and something about that mattered. My hands changed first, thicker, stronger, always dusted with remnants I couldn't scrub off, and then my voice, quieter but heavier, like each word weighed more. Jordan noticed. He said I seemed more rooted, more here, and I remember laughing, saying, "Clay doesn't lie, because it really doesn't. You press too hard, it folds, too soft, it slumps, too fast, it cracks." I started spending whole weekends at the studio, not to hide, but to make something that didn't ask to be impressive, just honest. When I told my mother about the gallery interest, she blinked twice, then said, "That's lovely, dear," the same way she once complimented a neighbor's tulips, polite but uninterested, and when I mentioned it would be a solo show, her mouth tightened. "And what exactly is it about?" I told her it was personal work, emotional, about memory and womanhood and silence, and she said, the kind of hum that always meant she was processing how to repackage it. She didn't ask to see the pieces, just asked who else would be there. She started asking again about what I wore, suggested lipstick shades I hadn't touched in years, offered to help plan the reception even though she hadn't stepped into an art gallery in over a decade. It was strange, watching her try to map herself onto something she didn't understand, like watching someone decorate a room they've never sat still in. I let her talk, let her believe she was contributing, because arguing felt like giving her another way in, and I wasn't willing to hand her that anymore. Jordan helped me build the frames, carried heavy things without asking questions, and told me the pieces felt like music, not in how they looked, but how they settled in the room, and for once, I believed him. I'd made 5 works, each one different in shape but similar in tone, muted, soft, like secrets whispered into wet clay, and they all felt like me, old versions, silenced moments, the girl I had been and the woman I'd become. I didn't name them after myself, but I didn't hide in them either. A week before the opening, I sent out the invitations myself, handwritten, simple, intentional. I debated whether to include my mother, not because I didn't want her there, but because I knew she'd bring expectations like perfume, unseen, heavy, impossible to ignore. In the end, I sent one, same as everyone else, no special note, just a time and a date and a name she hadn't heard me use before, Mira L. Ceramic Forms. I didn't call to follow up, didn't ask if she'd come, didn't need to. In the days leading up to the event, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, quiet, unshaken anticipation, not the kind fueled by anxiety, but the kind that comes from doing something entirely on your own terms. I wasn't hiding anymore, wasn't shrinking, wasn't performing for approval I'd never earn. Each night, I'd sit in the gallery alone, lights low, just me and the pieces and the space between them, and it felt like breathing underwater, but not drowning, like being seen without being explained. The night of the opening felt thick with weather, not rain, just that charged stillness that sits heavy on your skin, and inside the gallery, everything looked sharper, lit in ways that made the clay glow warm, like something alive. I'd worn linen, simple, no jewelry, my hair pinned in a loose knot I didn't fuss over, and Jordan stood nearby, letting the space be mine, not interrupting, just anchoring, just there. People started trickling in slowly, wine glasses filled, polite compliments were whispered, but I wasn't listening for praise, I was listening for recognition. The first piece they saw was the smallest, a low vessel with a chipped lip I'd chosen not to correct, its surface textured like scraped knees, childhood softness pressed into memory, and beside it, I'd written just one sentence, age 7, silenced over soup. No one asked for context, they just stared a little longer than usual, lips parted like they were about to speak, but didn't. I watched their faces, watched the shift happen in their bodies, that quiet hush that only truth can stir. My mother arrived late, perfume first, then pearls, then posture. She entered like she always did, scanning for familiar faces, not realizing the most familiar face in the room was already on the walls, in clay, in curve, in fracture. She wore a pale green blazer, the color she always said complemented my eyes, and carried a clutch too small to hold anything useful. When she saw me, her expression lifted into a smile too practiced to be spontaneous, and I kissed her cheek lightly, just enough to be polite. She didn't ask where to start. She just began walking, slow, deliberate steps, each piece drawing her closer to something she couldn't quite name. When she reached the third sculpture, a tall, narrowed form with a sealed top and ridged sides, she paused. The plaque beneath it read, "Formally obedient, privately breaking," and her jaw tensed, barely, like something flickered and then settled again. She looked over at me but didn't speak. Just nodded once, the way she used to do when a waiter brought the wrong wine, but she didn't want to make a scene. Guests circled her, smiling, offering casual hellos, but I watched her remain detached, like someone watching a language they almost understand but can't translate. By the time she reached the final piece, a low, round form cracked open at the center, with the inside glazed in gold, she stood very still, one hand resting on her hip, the other holding her clutch tighter than necessary. The title was simple, Inheritance, and nothing more. She didn't ask me what it meant, didn't ask who it was for, because she already knew. Later, someone asked if the exhibit was autobiographical, and I said, "Every woman's life is a series of held things," and left it at that. The gallery owner nodded, pleased, and people kept sipping, murmuring, moving on. My mother sat near the back, alone, and I let her. I didn't go to her, didn't explain, didn't soften what didn't need softening. She stayed seated for a long time, watching other people interact with something she used to control, something she couldn't reshape, something that had outgrown her hands. Jordan came up beside me just before closing, his palm brushing my lower back, a small gesture, grounding. "You look peaceful," he said, and I believed him. Not happy, not triumphant, just still, like the air had finally stopped pressing in. I glanced back at my mother's empty chair, her clutch still resting on it, forgotten or abandoned, and I didn't move to return it. Someone would pick it up eventually. Some things have a way of returning to their owners, even when their owners don't want them anymore. When the lights dimmed and the guests thinned, I walked the space alone, letting my fingers graze the air just above the pieces, not touching, just acknowledging. I didn't feel finished, just open, like this was a beginning disguised as an ending. In the corner, someone had written a note in the guest book that read, "I saw myself in the cracks, and I smiled, because that's the thing about clay, it only becomes strong after the fire." And I had stood through every inch of it. She never called after the show, not the next morning, not a week later, and I didn't chase the silence, didn't fill it with questions or apologies, because some silences aren't empty, they're full of what people choose not to say. Her clutch was returned by the gallery 2 days later, left at the front desk in a white box tied with navy ribbon, and I left it unopened on my shelf for weeks, not out of anger, just because it didn't feel like mine. Everything about it belonged to a version of me I'd already stepped away from. The weeks after felt slow in a good way, like walking barefoot on a warm floor, nothing urgent, nothing tight. I spent more time in the studio, hands sunk in cool earth, music low, windows cracked just enough to let the air move. People began reaching out, strangers, mostly, saying the exhibit made them cry, made them call their sisters, made them want to touch something real. It wasn't validation I was chasing, it was connection, and the strange part was how natural it felt, once I stopped asking for permission. Jordan moved in without us ever having a conversation about it. One weekend turned into 2, then his books showed up on my shelves and I didn't mind, didn't feel crowded. We cooked together in quiet, folded laundry in mismatched piles, talked about things we used to avoid, family, obligation, the quiet fear of turning into people we used to resent. Sometimes we didn't talk at all, and I liked those nights too, where his breathing was enough to remind me I wasn't alone, just quiet, just allowed to be. I found an old photo in a drawer, me at 11, standing beside my mother at some benefit, her hand resting on my shoulder, my smile stretched just a little too wide. I stared at it for a long time, remembering how heavy that dress felt, how long the event ran, how I stood so still because she asked me to. I didn't throw it away, just slid it back in, because memory isn't always about keeping or discarding. Sometimes it's just about knowing where things belong without letting them define you. The second exhibit came quickly, faster than I expected, and this time I didn't hesitate when they asked if I wanted to reserve a seat. I left one open in the third row, unmarked, unspoken, just a chair among others, like any other guest could have sat there. I didn't tell her, didn't send an invitation, didn't check if she knew, because part of growing up is learning that presence can't be forced. I didn't need her there to prove anything, and I didn't need her absence to make a point. The seats stayed empty all evening. Afterward, people lingered, not because of the art, but because of the air it created, soft, full of pause, full of things people couldn't quite name. One woman hugged me without asking, tears on her cheeks, saying, "I didn't know other people felt this way," and I hugged her back, not because I had answers, but because I knew exactly what she meant. The work wasn't about pain, not really, it was about what we build after it, what we carry, what we set down without ceremony. I passed the empty chair one last time before leaving, ran my fingers along the edge, not dramatically, just enough to feel the wood, the weight of something unoccupied, but still present. I didn't cry, didn't linger, just turned off the lights and locked the door behind me, the click of the key quieter than expected. Outside, the air smelled like spring, damp, new, alive, and I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, wondering if she'd ever let herself feel something that unstructured. Wondering if I ever truly had, until now. We drove home without music, windows down, hands resting quietly between us, and I watched the houses pass like postcards, brief glimpses into other lives. I wasn't looking for signs, wasn't waiting for anything to come full circle. Some stories don't need closure to be complete. Some love stays broken and still leaves you whole. And some daughters grow up to become women who stop asking to be chosen because they've already chosen themselves.